The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm Rosie Bloor.
And I'm Jason Palmer. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world.
After resisting for decades, the Chinese government has finally raised the retirement age. But an attempt to solve one problem, the pensions crisis, may have some surprising consequences in another part of Chinese society.
And imagine a diner, well-dressed, wearing cologne, fully moisturized, eating a low-fat chicken dish with peas, lentils, and a whiff of sage. Now imagine that it's a dog. We dive into the seemingly bottomless market for luxury pet care.
But first, Kamala Harris's campaign for the White House has attracted some surprising support. Recently, former Vice President Dick Cheney announced he would be voting for Harris in November. His daughter, Liz Cheney, once one of the most powerful Republicans in the House, told an event at Duke University that she would be too.
I have thought deeply about this, and because of the danger that Donald Trump poses, not only am I not voting for Donald Trump, but I will be voting for Kamala Harris in this election.
And a handful of Republicans even endorsed Harris on stage at the Democratic National Convention.
When I was press secretary, I got skewered for never holding a White House briefing. It's because, unlike my boss, I never wanted to stand at that podium and lie.
So let's get the hard part out of the way. I am a Republican. But tonight, I stand here as an American. An American that cares more about the future of this country than the future of Donald Trump.
But though these high-level Republicans say they'll never vote for Donald Trump, the party faithful seem unwilling to follow them.
4 years ago, Never Trump conservatives helped Joe Biden win.
Rebecca Jackson is our Southern correspondent.
Thousands of Americans who voted for Trump in 2016 then abandoned him in 2020, particularly white college-educated voters in the suburbs. But this time around, it's not so clear what kind of impact they'll have.
So, Becca, can you just explain to me what is a Never Trumper?
So initially, when the group was founded in 2015, 2016, around the time that Trump was campaigning for the first time, Never Trumpers were the Republicans, true conservatives, who believed that Trump was not the right candidate, and they would never vote for Trump. Now it's sort of changed because there are a lot of people who self-identify as Never Trumpers or part of the Never Trump camp who were initially on the Trump bandwagon and have now decided that he poses a unique threat to democracy. Some are political strategists and operatives who have worked in Republican politics for many years. You might remember groups like the Lincoln Project, a conservative political action committee that got lots of attention for viral ads that just pissed off Trump and got him to say angry things on social media about them.
Donald, it's just not working. You know it. The country is laughing at you. Eating pets? Really, Donald? That's all you got?
Others are politicians who were in office and maybe are not now, or some still are, and have decided that they don't want to go along with the MAGA movement. Big names here include people like General McMaster, Mitt Romney in the Senate, Jeff Duncan, the former lieutenant governor of Georgia, and Liz Cheney, who was ousted from her congressional post in Wyoming in 2022.
Can these Never Trumpers make any difference in the election, and particularly in the swing states where they would matter most?
It's not clear, but they're absolutely trying. A group called Republican Voters Against Trump is planning to spend $40 million in ads this cycle in swing states. What they're doing is they have former Republican voters who are just saying on air why they're not voting for Trump again and why other Republicans shouldn't either. The Lincoln Project is also spending big and hoping that they can flip two specific voter blocks right before the election. These are the Red Dawn conservatives who are old school Republicans who grew up in the Reagan era, who are uncomfortable with Trump's coziness with Russia, and Dobbs dads, millennial fathers who are having a hard time explaining abortion bans to their daughters.
So what are they actually trying to achieve? Are they trying to persuade people not to vote for Trump, or are they actually calling for people to vote for Harris?
So, Rosie, it's interesting. The movement is actually divided on that question. Some say that although Trump is a threat to democracy, Republicans shouldn't be compromising their conservative values and advocating for their constituents to vote for Kamala Harris, who really doesn't represent them. For example, Pat Toomey, who's a former senator from Pennsylvania, and let's just remember that Pennsylvania is probably the most consequential state in this election. He was on a show called Squawk Box on CNBC on September 3rd, and he told Joe Kernan, who's the host on that network, that he would vote for neither Trump nor Harris.
Hold on. You would prefer Kamala Harris? I acknowledge that the outcome is a binary situation, but my choice is not. I have the choice.
On the other hand, there's a camp within the Never Trump movement that's perhaps bigger that really thinks that this position is dangerous and that Never Trumpers should absolutely vote for Harris. But even within the movement, there's so much pessimism about changing minds. Charlie Sykes, a former conservative talk show host in Wisconsin, that's another important swing state, says Never Trump is a movement of leaders without followers.
And is he right? Is it a movement of leaders without followers?
It does seem so. If we look at Economist YouGov polling, since 2016, the percentage of Republicans who plan to vote for Trump actually rose from 80% to 90%. And swing voters, the share of Republican-leaning independents who plan to back him, overall hasn't really budged since 2020. That means that these voices are not actually catching on.
And Becca, why is there so little movement?
There are a couple possible reasons. The first is that the Republicans most aligned with the Never Trumpers, the more traditionalist George Bush Republicans, neoconservatives, they've probably already left the party. And the voters who have held on, the people who are still in the Republican Party, are probably less influenced by the elite old-timers like the Cheneys. But Rosie, one thing that really came to light while reporting this story is that despite all of these important people getting up and saying things that are quite controversial, the most persuadable voters are in fact the ones who are paying the least attention. So no matter how many campaign ads they're being bombarded with, and how many veteran politicians come out against Trump, they probably won't be listening.
Becca, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thanks for having me.
The Chinese government has decided to raise its retirement age for the first time in decades. And this is a response to a severe aging population crisis in that country. People over 60 already make up more than a fifth of its population, and that is likely going to get worse.
Jason Chow writes about foreign affairs for The Economist.
That is triggering a massive problem for its pension system. By some estimates, the country's basic pension fund will run out by 2035. Given those problems, raising the mandatory retirement age, which are some of the lowest in the world, has become absolutely necessary. But that risks creating a whole host of newer problems, and one of the most notable ones is in childcare.
So explain to me the link, Jason, between retirement age and childcare in China.
China doesn't provide a lot of publicly funded childcare. In fact, most Chinese families rely on their grandparents to take care of toddlers and infants. According to state media, fewer than 8% of Chinese toddlers are actually enrolled in nurseries. And so you can see how grandparents play such a huge role. In fact, some research suggests that in many cities, up to 80% of households rely on grandparents.
So if grandparents are looking after kids, the concern is that raising the retirement age means that couples may have children later or even not at all, right?
That's right, because having grandparents take care of the children is so important. So keeping them in the workforce for 3 to 5 years longer will probably force women to wait to have children or just not have them at all. China's fertility rate is 1.1, which means very few women have more than one child. And that's one of the lowest in the world. It's well below the 2.1 rate that's required to keep population stable. And because China has very few immigrants, it can rely on that to boost its fertility rate. According to studies published last year, women who rely on grandparents for childcare are 4 times more likely to have a second kid than women who do not have that support. Essentially, without grandparents around, you face a situation of, I don't want a second kid. I don't want to have children that would actually be necessary to boost the fertility rate, or just delaying much later when the grandparents are retiring, in which case some women might not be able to have children.
Seeing grandparents with tiny grandkids is a staple of life in China, as are villages populated only by the young and the old, with working-age people leaving. But why can't people in China pay for childcare like they do everywhere else?
Historically, China had a pretty robust, for its time, publicly funded childcare system. Now, that's basically been curtailed since the 1980s and 1990s when China liberalized its economy. And much of the welfare state has been privatized. And because the retirement age is so low, this was, having grandparents take care of children was just simply kind of the most economical solution for a lot of households. So with the retirement age reforms, a lot of families are scrambling to think of an alternative.
You've said that the Chinese government wants to increase fertility. So is there any sense it will make any moves on childcare costs?
There is no indication that they will do anything, but the risks are really mounting. Essentially, what we're seeing here is almost a circular problem, right? So raising the retirement age was partially meant to increase the population in the labor force, because obviously a shrinking workforce will be very bad for China's economy, which is already facing a severe slowdown. But with newer reforms, and essentially we're giving lots of Chinese women a very difficult choice to make here. Either you probably deepen the fertility crisis because mothers just won't give birth anymore, or you worsen the labor force crisis because a lot of mothers would have to ditch work and do childcare themselves. And that seems to be a rising problem, and the government is starting to recognize it. But the pension crisis almost trumps all these concerns now at this point. And so they're really just focusing on tackling that instead of these underlying crises that will emerge over time.
So how does all this feed into growing anxieties about slowing growth in China's economy?
One of the demographics that's most unhappy about this change is young people. Young people have been voicing their discontent with the government and with these policy changes on social media. It's so difficult to find a job now for a lot of younger people. The labor market is very tight. For some of these younger people, they think that the new policy will keep older workers in the workforce longer, and that will make it harder for younger workers to enter the labor market. And that's probably not true, because making people work for longer could encourage them to consume more. It could boost the economy. It could create jobs. But when enough people believe that this is the case, that if you have older people around, they will lose out, this perception itself is worrying enough for the government. And so there are netizens, for example, that called on the experts who recommended the retirement age reforms to die. And censors have already moved in to remove some of these comments. The Chinese government, which is stability obsessed, saw what happened when a lot of people are very discontent about pension reforms, as you saw in France last year. And so those kinds of backlash and those kinds of sustained protest is hard enough for a liberal democracy. It would be the stuff of nightmares for China.
Jason, thanks very much. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Rosie. Thanks for having me on.
To hear about a very different side to life in China, do check out today's episode of Drum Tower, our weekly podcast on China. David Rennie is interviewing Michael Kovrig, who was incarcerated in China for nearly 3 years until 2021. An extraordinary tale of hostage diplomacy. Over 2 episodes, for the first time, Michael tells his own story of the experience.
People are spending money on all kinds of things for their pets.
Avantika Chilkoti is The Economist's global business correspondent.
On Airbnb nowadays, the bookings website, you can see people splashing out on mansions that come with pet-friendly ponds and blankets, especially for dogs. I've spoken to pet food companies that show off about how their dishes are taste tested by human beings. One of these companies, called Butternut Box, has a favourite dish, a chicken dish, that is made with just a whiff of sage. One of my favourite brands is called Dog by Lisa. It's an Australian brand started by a vet. And she sells all kinds of colognes and balms, specifically for dogs. I asked her, do dogs really need to be moisturised? And she says, it's just like humans. She said to me, would you wash your face and not moisturise afterwards? So it really seems like there's very little that people wouldn't do for their pets nowadays.
And to the tune of what kind of cost are we talking about here, keeping one's dog moisturised?
So just last year, people spent $186 billion in America on their pets. And this is not just products. It's not just things like moisturizers. That includes everything from vet bills to insurance to food and treats and grooming products. The thing is, at the moment, in the consumer world, you have a massive crunch. You've got high inflation, people are worried about their jobs, they're cutting back spending on themselves, and yet the amount that people plan to spend on their pets is going up and up. I spoke to some analysts at Morgan Stanley, and they reckon it's going to go up to $261 billion by 2030. So a cost of living crisis is not going to affect this industry.
But why not? If people won't spend it on themselves, why are they spending more on the pets?
There's two dynamics here. One is just to do with pet ownership. So during the pandemic, when everyone was locked down, the idea of having a dog or a cat seemed quite nice. It wasn't much of a hassle to take a dog for a walk when the world was shut down. It wasn't a hassle to be home to feed the cat when there was nowhere to go. So lots of people adopted pets at that time. So you had a slight jump in pet ownership. At the same time, people are just spending more per pet. There's this real change in how people think of the animals in their homes. The saying is the dog has gone from the garden to the front room to the bedroom to actually being on your bed. People consider themselves the pet's parent. And of course, when you think of something as your child, as your offspring, you're probably going to spend more on it. In particular, young pet owners who make up a larger share of pet ownership in general, they're really willing to splash out on the animals.
Why is that? What's the generational divide there?
So in particular, millennials are now the biggest demographic of pet owners. A lot of millennials have put off getting married and having babies, and they're getting pets instead. Gen Z is not far behind. Gen Z is now leaving their parents' home, finishing studies, and a lot of them are getting pets as well. From all kinds of research, you can see that younger pet owners are willing to spend more. Surveys show that they take their animals to the vet more often. They're also spending more on things like gifts at Christmas or birthdays for their pets. So they're really spoiling these animals, and they are, in some cases, adopting them in place of having their own children.
And presumably the companies that provide all this stuff, the gifts and the foods and the moisturizers and so on are, and I choose my words carefully here, lapping it up.
They are indeed. So I've mentioned to you some startups doing high-end products, vegan grooming products, GMO-free grooming products. But actually, what's really surprised me in reporting this story is how a lot of the big consumer groups I think about, they're actually pet companies. So take Mars. You probably think of Mars as producing those calorific, chewy chocolate bars. But actually, 2/3 of Mars's turnover last year came from the pets division. They produce pet food, but they also have loads of veterinary clinics. It's the same for Nestle. It's the same for Colgate. You have these really big consumer groups that you might not realize it, but they're actually pet businesses. And they're growing very fast. You're seeing lots of other companies trying to get into the business of pets. You've actually got so much private equity money going into the veterinary sector that there's antitrust concerns. They've bought up so many vet clinics. You've had consolidation. Both in Britain and in America, you've got regulators worried about that.
And we were going to need a pet-related regulator just to handle all of this. I mean, as far as what people will do for their pets, spend on their pets, after this chat, I'm wondering, what's the limit? What next?
Honestly, Jason, I don't have a pet. And in reporting this story, I've been flabbergasted. I can't imagine what the limit will be. In my research, I found people who have private jets kitted out just so their pet can be comfortable on board. So it seems like there's really nothing they wouldn't do for the animals.
Okay, you have provided me with a link here, and I have clicked through to something called Vista Pet, which, quote, ensures that loyal companions receive the same excellent support as their owners. There's a picture of a dog climbing up the little stairs to what is clearly a private jet. There's a in-flight amenity kit, chew toys, the spray bottle full of something no doubt soothing. Safe and soft cabin is advertised. I mean, I want to be a pet more than I want to be a human at this point. Avantika, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Don't you think you want to get a pet, or does it now sound too expensive?
It's inefficient.
That's an economist's way of thinking about it. That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. We'll see you back here tomorrow.